Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about how to write programs for resistance training. And now, real fast, resistance training can include your normal strength training. It includes calisthenics, band work, all that sort of stuff is included under this sort of umbrella term. And in this video, we're going to talk about how you stop going from doing random lifts on random days to how do you structure your program and put some thought into it so that results become a bit more predictable over time? It may come off as a bit of semantics, but to me, this is really where you go from just exercising to actually training. And a lot of the guidelines and recommendations that you'll see on this sort of stuff online and the research and things like that are usually written with the idea that this is the primary focus of your life. So if you're a professional athlete or something like that, that's really the lens through which that sort of research is done. In this video and in this guide, I made every effort to sort of put all of that evidence into a bit more of a truly practical lens so that this sort of stuff is more applicable if this isn't the primary focus of your life. So there are a number of references and studies that I will be using to support a lot of the information that I say throughout this video. If you're interested in checking those out, those can be linked next to the claims that they seek to support in the article down below that accompanies this video. But again, I've written a lot of different training programs over the years or for a number of different people. And there are a number of things that I think just make all of this evidence a bit more practical. So my intention is to make all of this stuff very applicable to everyday life. Now, this video is not going to go over the sort of minutia or the nuances of training different movement patterns or training different muscles to their most optimal state. Rather, this is meant to cover all of the truly fundamental principles that should be present in really any training program that you write or any training program that you follow. So with that said, here are our talking points for the video today. These first 4 points are really where a lot of these sort of practical adaptation to everyday life of the evidence sort of come in. And then this back half, starting from exercise selection and beyond, is going to be a bit more just truly evidence-based, research-backed, that sort of thing. But again, we're going to start with a bit more of the practical stuff so that all of this is put into a bit better context for you. Now, when I talk about writing training programs or following a training program for any type of goal, this is always the first thing that I start with. And it's the idea of just getting very clear, at least as clear as you can, on what specifically you want to achieve. So when it comes to resistance training specifically, the two major ones that most people are probably going to be here for are building strength and building muscle. However, I have some clients who work with me because they were told that they have become osteopenic or osteoporotic, and they're trying to sort of fight that off with resistance training, which is one of the three main ways from a lifestyle perspective you would do so. Or let's say you are pursuing some other sport or discipline and you want to reduce your risk of injury there. All of these are going to occur in some way, shape, or form when you perform resistance training. But the clearer you get on which one of these means the most to you, the faster your results for that specific goal will be. And I think the easiest example to sort of illustrate this is to compare the two different goals of building strength versus building muscle. And now, again, as I say here, these are mostly the same adaptation. Like if you've built strength, you've built muscle, and conversely, if you've built muscle, then you've probably built strength too. However, there are a couple pieces of nuance that can make you sort of optimize. I don't necessarily like that term too much, but lean one direction or the other. So let's say that your primary goal is strength training, or getting stronger is like priority number one for you. So one, it's first worth understanding that strength is in part a skill, and we're going to cover that idea a little bit later. But the more practiced you are at any given movement pattern, the stronger you're going to be at that movement pattern, regardless of how much muscle you have. Now, obviously, to a certain point, you can't just good technique your way up to a 315 squat without putting on an actual muscle, but it is a decently notable component. For example, if your primary goal is to get stronger at the barbell back squat, and as you perform the lift under heavy loads, if you are sort of fidgeting on the way down and you're sort of shifting in your position and you're losing energy on the way up and way down, you're not going to be able to express as much strength as you probably could for any given amount of muscle mass that you have. So with that in mind, your exercise selection might include a number of different variations of the barbell back squat, so you get that much more practice doing the movement as opposed to other forms of leg exercises that you could do. Moreover, lateral raises or dumbbell side raises are a great exercise to add muscle to the shoulder. I mean, no one's going to question that. But if your goal is to improve your deadlift strength as much as possible, then dumbbell lateral raises aren't really going to do too much for that goal. So again, if your goal is just general muscle growth sort of all over the body, then lateral raises, arguably are not mandatory, but they really should be in your program in some way, shape, or form. But if your goal is to just build your deadlift strength as much as possible, then I don't really see too much rationale for including them. And now again, just to reiterate this point up here, there is no wrong answer here. You can choose anything you want, but you do need an answer. At least all your results are going to be that much more effective and achieve them that much more easily if you do have an answer to this. And if you select one goal for right now, it doesn't mean you have to commit to that goal for the rest of your life. Because again, if you've built strength, then you've built muscle and vice versa. So as you go along time and your sort of training preferences change over time, you can change your goals however you want. My only recommendation there is to keep the same goal for at least 3 months at a time, because that way you're able to see some real material progress toward that one goal. Whereas, if you're changing goals every 4 weeks, then, you really didn't ever have an actual goal in the first place. The next component is how long any individual training block is going to last. So the easiest way I can describe a training block, if you're not familiar, is to say this. So let's say within a given week, there are a certain number of trainings that you seek to complete. If you have a predictable schedule, like a 9 to 5, then you can have them done on specific days. So let's say you do like a full body on Monday, lower body on Thursday, upper body on Friday, something like that. Or it could just be something where, let's say you have an unpredictable schedule, like you're a shift worker in healthcare. Like I have a client who is a surgeon, I have a client who is a nurse, I have a client who is a pilot. So obviously those are all very unpredictable schedules. They can just be a set of trainings that you seek to complete within the week, and you just sort of structure your schedule however makes most sense on a week-to-week basis. But nevertheless, the idea is that those trainings you complete on a week-to-week basis are, for the most part, the same, and you have planned progressions of those trainings week over week over week. This is what allows you to predictably adapt to those trainings over time and have those adaptations compound over time. And this sort of structure gives you a sort of compounding effect that doing different stuff every week can just never really give you. So that said, how long these training blocks should last, I typically write them about 4 to 8 weeks at a time, with 4 being the floor and 8 being the ceiling. Because again, in my experience, or my opinion, 4 weeks is going to be the least amount of time for you to really see any sort of notable jump in your performance from any given training block. And then I sort of arbitrarily say 8 weeks is the ceiling, partly because you're rarely ever going to be able to include everything that you want to train in any individual training block. So at some point you have to change things, rotate things, so that over the course of, let's say, an entire year, you have over that time a complete training program. And so again, arbitrarily, but a ceiling of 8 weeks just sort of ensures that you cycle through those at a sufficient rate. So when you are deciding on how many days per week that you are going to dedicate towards resistance training, or really any amount of training, whether you're including aerobic endurance or anything else, there's a sort of 2-step process I recommend that you do this. So 1, identify the number of days you can commit on your busiest week. So like when work is crazy and you have family in town and all the things are happening, on those sort of weeks, what is the number of training days you can actually commit to and you will get done on a week-to-week basis? And then identify that on a normal or more free week, what is the number of training days that you would like to do on that type of week? And now again, if you have a somewhat predictable schedule week to week, those number of days per week might be the exact same, and that's okay. However, if they are different, it's worth knowing that, because it changes how you structure each individual training session. Mostly in the sense that on the days you can commit to, on your busiest weeks, you allocate your most important, highest priority, most goal-oriented stuff onto those days, and everything else that is less oriented towards your goals, more of an accessory sort of thing, you allocate on the days you can get to on a less busy week. So in the programs that I write for my clients, they typically range from anywhere from 2 to 4 days of resistance training specifically. That doesn't mean training only, but just resistance training itself. And this is in part because all of the clients that I have somewhat of a mixed strength plus aerobic endurance type of goal. Some are just trying to improve their 5K or 10K. Some are training for 100K or 100-mile races. I don't think I mentioned it, but that should be part of your sort of goal process. In other words, when you're deciding on what you specifically want to achieve, that shouldn't just apply to resistance training. It should also apply to the idea that, is there anything else you want to pursue or train for apart from this specifically? So going back to this real fast, 2 days per week, yes, that is enough. I'll speak to that when we speak about volume a little bit later. But 4 is typically the ceiling, again, because at least for the people that I coach, it leaves room for other training. But again, this is the most amount of resistance training days per week that's still going to allow it to sort of ebb and flow with life. So once you have all of that information decided on, then you can decide how you're actually going to split up your strength training. And just really quickly, as we go through here, I may use strength training or resistance training or lifting or stuff like that all synonymous. You can just assume they're the same. So no, there's no real rule to what's right or what's wrong here. There's really just 2 criteria that I would recommend you try to follow. So 1, don't train any individual muscle group 2 days in a row, give it at least 4 to 8 hours of rest in between. Now, as I say down here, isometric training, such as a plank. So this is any sort of exercise where you're not moving through range of motion, you're just holding a position and fighting gravity. These tend to be much more recoverable than actually moving through a range of motion. So in other words, if you did 2 sets or 3 sets of a Superman exercise today, you probably still can deadlift tomorrow without any increased risk of injury. The second criteria I would recommend is to try to train each muscle at least 2 times per week. So in the research, training a muscle group 2 times per week tends to beat training it 1 time per week, whereas training it 3 times per week doesn't tend to beat 2 times per week. So 3 isn't wrong. It's just not better than 2. So at that point, it's really more about preference than anything else. And now this assumes the same total weekly volume though. And we're going to speak about volume itself pretty soon here. But let's just say that you were going to do 9 sets of bench press for your chest in a week. Splitting that up into a Monday and a Thursday is going to beat doing all of those sets on Monday, but doing Monday, Wednesday, Friday, splitting that up evenly across those 3 days is not going to beat the Monday and Thursday structure. And again, if the total number of sets across the week are the same. Part of the reason for that is that your average set quality is just that much higher when it is more split up across the week. So if you did all of your sets of bench press on Monday, the back half of those sets are being done with much more fatigue than the first half of the sets. Where if you split those up into Monday and Thursday, all the sets that are being done on Thursday, which would have been the back half on Monday, are being done with the same amount of freshness that you would have had on Monday. And then real quickly, something I didn't mention about giving 48 hours of rest in between training each individual muscle. Any sort of low intensity work, like if it's low intensity swimming, can be done the day before or after an upper body strength training session. If it's low intensity cycling or running, usually that can be done the day before or after running, lower body lifting. Now, this idea of load management across different disciplines of training is something I've covered in other articles and videos. I'll link that down below in case you're interested. So that all said, the 3 training splits that I use most commonly are either full body workouts, so that'd be like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday sort of thing, or a Monday, Thursday sort of thing if it's a 2-day per week structure. Upper lower if the person has time for 4 days of strength training in the week, or a full upper lower. And so this full upper lower can look like a full body again on Monday, lower body on Thursday, upper body on Friday, or however else it works to sort of meet these criteria up here. So when you talk about what exercises you're actually going to do in your program, again, whether the goal is muscle growth or strength is going to sort of alter what the best course of action for you is. If muscle growth is goal number 1, then the most important thing to keep into account is that mechanical tension is the number 1 driver of this happening. And in practice, what that means is that you want the tensile strength of the muscle you're training to be the limiting factor of the movement. So a couple examples of what I mean by that. If you were to do a squat into a shoulder press, holding the dumbbells up near your shoulders, the weight that you can use on that sort of movement is always going to be limited by the strength of your shoulders and not your legs. Thus, the amount of mechanical tension relative to the strength of each muscle group is going to be much greater for the shoulders than the legs. And you're never actually going to build much muscle in your legs because they can't really hit that sort of mechanical tension threshold. If an exercise is too unstable, that's also going to distract from the amount of pure mechanical tension you can put into that target muscle, and thus take away from the muscle growth response that you are likely to get. Now, at this point, I think is worth viewing with a bit of a grain of salt. Some exercises are inherently unstable, but still good to do for the purpose of muscle growth. Most single leg training I would put into that bucket. So a Bulgarian split squat, overall, inherently unstable of an exercise, but still great for muscle growth long term. But something like a quadruped row or a renegade row, you're never going to be able to make those stable enough to really make them actually conducive for muscle growth. And the last thing worth mentioning is that energy production of the movement itself should not be the limiting factor to the movement. Now, I have another article and video talking about energy system development, which really is what conditioning actually is. I'll link that down below if you're interested in that. But for now, the 2 things for the most part that could cause this is 1, any set that lasts more than 45 seconds in duration, or 2, if you're resting too little in between sets. And why I say 45 seconds and why or how much you should be resting in between sets, we're going to talk about with due time. And now again, strength and muscle growth are mostly the same thing. But if strength is your number 1 goal, there are a few other things that I would take into account. So to start, let's say that the deadlift, getting stronger on deadlift, is priority number 1 for you. There are a number of different muscles along that movement that could be the weak link in that chain. It could be the hamstrings, the glutes, the strength of your traps, strength of your grip, strength of your low back, or a number of different things. Let's say, for example, that we've identified that the strength of your lower back, the spinal erectors, are the weak link in that chain, and you have time in a workout for 1 more exercise. Doing something specifically for these spinal erectors is going to pay you more dividends for the goal of building up your deadlift strength than doing side raises. And again, I don't mean to really bash on this exercise that much. It's a great exercise. I program it all the time. It just makes an easy comparator for this example. And again, strength is in part a skill. So apart from the actual movement itself, you might program more variations of that movement so that you get more different types of practice doing it. So if the barbell back squat is your number one goal, then you might do things like pin squats, you might do pause squats, tempo, stuff like that, all for the purpose of getting better at the actual movement itself. So when I say volume of strength training, what I mean to say is how much of it you're actually doing on a week-to-week basis. And the way we measure this is that the number of sets taken 1 to 3 reps shy of failure per muscle group per week. Or you can also do per movement per week if strength is your goal more so than muscle growth. So what this means is that there's a certain intensity threshold for any set to count towards your weekly volume, meaning warm-up sets don't count for the most part. So to make that a bit more real, let's say you are doing barbell back squats with what you can do 10 reps with. Any set in which you do 7 reps or more is going to count towards this weekly volume. And generally speaking, we'll talk about intensity in a sec, but the less volume you're doing per week, the closer to failure in each set you want to get. And the more volume you're doing per week, the farther away, closer to that 3 rep shy failure you want to get in all your sets. And again, failure just means the point at which you can't do any more reps, either with good technique or the muscle itself is just unable to contract anymore. Tons of different ways you can sort of cut that, but any definition like that works. Now, one point about this definition that can come off as a bit confusing, but works in practice, is how you count volume for accessory muscles. So if you imagine a barbell bench press, the chest is the main muscle group moving the weight, but the shoulders and triceps are still very much active, still very much moving the weight, but not the prime mover of the movement. When the muscle is worked in that way, it's usually given a half set of volume towards its total weekly volume count. And again, that's very abstract, but as a means of tracking volume over time, it tends to reliably predict how you're going to adapt and what results you're going to get from any amount of volume. So for instance, let's say we cloned 2 people just so that everything else is the same. We had one person do 8 sets of barbell bench press. One person did 4 sets of dumbbell skull crushers, more of an isolated tricep exercise. Those 2 people will see the same growth in the triceps over time, very likely, because the volume for the triceps is the same. So the least amount of volume that you could do in a given week and still reliably see improvements in strength or muscle growth over time is 4 sets per muscle group per week. And now I just want to emphasize that how low that actually is. It's very easy to hit double that for most major muscle groups with just 2 full body workouts per week. More volume than this tends to be better, but there is a diminishing rate of return the higher volume you go. So for instance, going from 4 sets per week to 6 sets per week is going to give you much more benefit than going from 10 sets per week to 12 sets per week, even though those are the same sort of absolute increase in weekly volume. In my opinion, the sweet spot for how much volume you should be doing on a weekly basis is somewhere between 6 to 12 sets per movement per week. And I call this a sweet spot from a standpoint of finding the intersection of what is actually practical to commit to over time and what's going to sort of maximize the results you get from any given time investment. So intensity we kind of already covered because it is inherent to our definition of volume. But just to reiterate, for a set to be sufficiently stimulating for the purpose of building strength or building muscle or building bone or anything else, it has to be at least 1 to 3 reps shy of failure. Again, failure being the point at which you can't do any more reps because you just can't move the weight anymore. With other forms of training, like aerobic endurance training, you might program different training sessions at different intensities with all those different intensities deriving specific adaptations, but that's not really true for strength training. So as far as how many reps to do in each set, it really doesn't matter as long as you are getting 1 to 3 reps shy of failure. So I have another article video where I cover this idea in a bit more detail than I'm going to cover here right now. But basically, historically, there's been this idea that training with low reps, meaning heavyweight, is specific to strength. Training with moderate reps, usually defined as like 6 to 12 reps, that sort of rep range, is specific to muscle growth. And then high reps is being specific to muscular endurance. However, this relationship really partly emerged from how these studies themselves were designed. So for instance, if you had 2 people train the barbell back squat, again, let's say they're cloned so that everything else is accounted for. One person did it with very low reps, like 3 to 5. One person did it with higher reps, like 8 to 12. But both of them took every set, the same number of sets per week, 1 to 3 reps shy of failure. So the intensity, as we've defined it before, and the volume, as we've defined it before, is the same. If you then had them do a 1 rep max test, the person who was training with heavier weights is probably going to be a bit stronger than the lower weight person because they have a lot more practice doing that movement with heavy weight. However, if you test them on a different movement like a leg press where that skill component is largely taken out, you'll see the same result of strength and muscle growth in each of them. So in other words, any set where you did 5 reps and you could have done 7, or you did 15, but you could have done 17, those are the exact same thing. There's no difference between those two. So how many exact reps you do isn't really what matters. The fact that you get close to failure is what matters. Tracking your rest in between sets is something that most people don't do, but I really think everyone should do, because it can make a big difference for how time efficient workouts are and how effective they are. Because if you rest too little in between sets, and all of your sets will end up being just not that stimulating for the purpose of building strength and building muscle, because you're too tired to really hit that actual intensity level that we spoke about before. But if you rest too long, your workouts can easily become way too long, or at least way longer than they should be or need to be. So this has been studied quite extensively. Typically, resting less than 60 seconds per set, or in between each set, in between when each individual muscle group is trained, is going to impair the results you see over time. But resting more than 90 to 120 seconds isn't going to be better than resting within this range. Now, this becomes a little bit different when you talk about supersets, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you are doing straight sets, like you're just doing 3 sets of bench press straight with nothing else fancy added, then my typical recommendation is to set a timer for 2 minutes in between sets, and then that's when you go for each next one. So the idea of progressive overload is fundamental and instrumental to whether or not you see results over time. But most people misunderstand what it actually is, in my opinion. Most people view progressive overload as something you can do, when in reality, it's something that just happens as a result of a good training program. So let's say you do a set of an exercise where you do 9 reps and you could have done 10. Your body adapts to that stimulus, and the next week you do the same number of reps, you do 9, but you could have done 11. So the first week you had 1 repetition in reserve, the second week you had 2 repetitions in reserve. In that second week, that set was still stimulating enough, still intense enough to elicit an adaptation in your body, to elicit growth in muscle or improvement in strength. Eventually, that weight and rep scheme, as you adapt more, will become insufficient to elicit any further adaptation. You don't necessarily have to wait for the weight or rep scheme to become insufficient to elicit gains for you. You can, progress before that happens. But the point is, the adaptation happens first and then the progression happens. So in other words, you don't necessarily have to beat the logbook or beat what you did last week every week in order to see results over time. Instead, what you really need to focus on is if the volume and intensity that you're doing is of sufficient dose to produce the goals that you're after. Now, I don't want to leave this slide super gray, super vague. I will give you something a bit more concrete to sort of follow. One thing you can do is once any given weight and rep scheme feels like a 7 or 8-ish out of 10 effort, at that point, it can become time to progress that movement. Whether you progress the weight you use or the reps you do with that weight doesn't really seem to matter. If the load increases either from a weight or a rep perspective, either is fine. You just do so in an effort to put yourself in a more appropriate intensity range. People will often ask me how many exercises they should do in any given workout. And I think a better question to ask is how many sets should you be doing in any given workout? Because if you do 8 exercises and 2 sets each, that's the same thing as doing 4 exercises at 4 sets each. They're both 16 exercises, or 16 sets, I'm sorry. Plus, single arm and single leg exercises effectively double your volume for that given exercise, because at least as far as I know, you have 2 arms and or 2 legs. So when you are deciding on this, there's 2 things that I think are worth taking into account. One, how much actual time do you have to dedicate towards the given training session? Typically, 16 sets within a given training session, with warm-up included, will take about an hour, although for some people it'll take 15 minutes plus or minus, depending on what sort of exercises make up the workout, plus what sort of environment the person is training in. You can also think about how much volume are you getting elsewhere in the week, and how much do you need in this individual workout in order to hit your total weekly volume goals, as we've discussed before. So with that said, there's really no right or wrong way to think about this, and it should be more driven by practicality and preference, but those are the considerations that I would say for this specific question. So again, my purpose or my intention with this video is to make it a sort of what are the fundamentals of the strength training sort of video. Supersets and drop sets, which we'll talk about right after this, many people might not describe as a fundamental of strength training, but I do think they are helpful enough to include in this type of video. The reason being is that they can slash your training time by a half or a third while giving you these same exact results in terms of muscle growth and strength. So starting with supersets. A superset is when you go back and forth between 2 different exercises that have no overlapping muscles, as opposed to doing straight sets of any one individual exercise. So the difference would be, instead of doing 3 sets of barbell bench press and then 3 sets of a dumbbell row, you do a set of a barbell bench press, set of a row, back and forth in that sort of manner. The idea is that while the muscles responsible for a barbell bench press are working, the muscles used in the row are resting. So that even if you rest 1 minute instead of the 2 that I told you before, each individual muscle is still getting the rest it needs to perform at the level it needs to produce a sufficient adaptation. And there are studies to show that people who use only supersets versus only straight sets, when all the exercises are the exact same and the supersets have no overlapping muscles, they will see the exact same growth in muscle with about half the training time invested. Now, this strategy breaks down if you are supersetting two muscles that have overlapping movements. So a squat and a deadlift are both going to train the adductors of the hip and the lower back and the glutes quite extensively. So that wouldn't really make too much sense as a superset, but a reverse lunge and a seated leg curl don't really have too many overlapping muscles. So that one would make sense. And then lastly, the final point worth talking about today are drop sets. So a drop set is where you do a set of a given exercise, drop the load by about 30ish%, does not need to be perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and then you immediately continue without rest. The idea is that you stay at that near failure point for just that much longer, and functionally, one drop set can equal two traditional sets. And again, there are studies of people doing the same exercises, but either doing straight sets or drop sets. And the people who do drop sets typically get the same growth in muscle with up to a third of the training time invested. Now, this is most easily done with machines or dumbbells, although, there's a gym etiquette consideration if you're taking up too many dumbbells at one time. Barbells are a little more impractical because you're sort of forced to take a break to take the plates off, put new ones on and stuff like that. You can use mechanical drop sets to accomplish this. So an example would be doing regular push-ups or weighted push-ups as many as you can, and then dropping into knee push-ups right away and continue to do more just like that. But these do tend to be much more fatiguing. Same thing with the supersets than regular straight sets. So that's just a consideration to keep into account. Things might feel harder. And so for drop sets specifically, oftentimes what I'll do is just program the last set of an exercise as a drop set, and then the first however many they're doing as regular sets. So with that said, that's all that I have to talk about in this video. Here are some summary points to try and summarize everything we talked about before. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything to say about anything that I said in this video, don't hesitate to comment down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Apart from that, I hope you have a great day. I'll speak to you soon, and see you later.